Hello there, Happy New Year, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And if you're joining us after many episodes, welcome back. I've been away for a few weeks. If this is your first time, well, stick with us. We've got another year ahead of interesting stuff to talk about, think about, read, and just generally explore. So I'm looking today at The Making of Global Capitalism by Panitch and Sam Gindin. And hopefully, as we go throughout the year and, probably next and the one after that, we'll look more and more at this book because it's really an extraordinary masterwork in explaining, particularly in the post-war era, explaining the dominance of the United States of America on the shaping of capitalism, and the idea that capitalism isn't this sort of spontaneous, naturally occurring phenomena. It's a thing made by states, and it's a thing regulated and enforced by states, particularly dominant states like the United States and before it, Great Britain. So here we are talking in the first chapter about what the two authors refer to as the DNA of American capitalism. And the authors write, "The role that the United States came to play in the making of global capitalism was not inevitable, but nor was it accidental. The American empire did not appear from nowhere, but comparing it with empires of the past, usually beginning with Rome's and ending with Britain's, tends to miss precisely what is distinctive about the American empire. When the new Republic of the United States was founded, the term empire was quite often used to describe it. George Washington was not the only founding father to do so when he spoke of it ambitiously as a rising empire, but proponents of American power gradually ceased to use the word. Unlike previous empires, the new American empire was primarily built without colonies. The early articulation of dynamic capitalist development at home with the Monroe Doctrine abroad involved building the continental territorial expansion of the Republic directly into the American state structure, while at the same time trying to contain and finally sweep out the colonies established in the Western Hemisphere by the European powers. This laid the foundation, despite the few colonies the US took over from Spain at the beginning of the 20th century, for eventual global reach of informal American empire." So this is something that has been said on many occasions, that what you see with the ability of the United States to project its power far beyond its borders. You can currently see, look at the example of Ukraine at the moment, or Iraq 15 to 20 years ago. The ability of, and countless other examples going back to for over 100 years, the ability of America to do this, to influence the workings of markets and governments, and to win direct wars or proxy wars, is evidence of American empire. And the limiting factor, or was the kind of the argument that against this, and it's a flawed argument, I would submit, is that America, with a number of notable exceptions, has rarely established its own colonies, and like, say, for example, the British Empire. Writing a few years before World War I, Karl Kautsky observed, "The United States shows us our social future within capitalism. Insofar as this turned out to be true, it was because the way American capitalism and its worldwide appeal, the attractive power of the US models of production and culture," writes Kautsky, emerged out of the particular matrix of its own social history. As Perry Anderson goes on to say, "The unencumbered property rights, untrammeled litigation, the invention of the corporation that distinguished the US in the 19th century was part and parcel of the US's remarkable economic dynamism in the 20th, leading to what Karl most feared, a juridical system disembedding the market as far as possible from ties of custom, tradition, or solidarity, whose very abstraction from them later proved American firms, like American films, exportable, reproducible across the world in ways that no other competitor could quite match. This prediction by Polanyi, I guess it helps us to navigate the awesome kind of all-conquering power of American capital in the 20th century, and the ability of America from the mass production of the Ford Model T all the way to the creation of things like Amazon, to harness market power and sort of strip it away from local, regional or national roots, and then recreate it in almost a kind of like a viral way in territories which are often very alien to the USA, and do it successfully. The idea that there are kind of McDonald's in places that have no kind of no history, no historical, social, cultural connection to American fast food is now almost kind of meaningless, a meaningless thing to observe, and that shows how kind of omnipresent not just American culture but American capital has become. American capital simply mines aspects of American culture and then creates them as kind of disposable, marketable assets. And you can see this if you walk past a Disney store or something like that. The author's right. Combined here were, on the one hand, the invention in the US of the modern corporate form, scientific management of the labour process, and assembly line mass production, and on the other, Hollywood-style narrative and visual schemas stripped of their most abstract, thereby not only appealing to the aggregating successive waves of immigrants, but ensuring that US consumption patterns were widely emulated abroad. But the role of the state in this could not be ignored. And this is the key bit. The steady transformation of the international merchant law and arbitration in conformity with US standards is witness to the process. So whether or not American capital and mass culture came to dominate the 20th century is sort of the secondary issue. It's the how. And the story that markets are these kind of unicorn-like kind of conceptions that simply appear out of nowhere and act in ways that are slightly beyond the conception of the normal mortal. Well, this is nonsense, really. Markets are the product of the states that create them, and markets are shaped in particular ways. Politics is and always something that kind of is the precursor to markets, and not the other way around. In order for there to be the success of American capital and other capitalisms as well, but predominantly American capital, the post-war rules of trade and of debt and the laws that allowed a certain kind of modern extraterritoriality almost, has allowed for US investors and investors from other countries, but again this was dominated by American investors, to operate in foreign countries without fear of them being expropriated or taxed or whatever. These are these laws which were the product of the first generation of post-war neoliberals. If you want a really good book on that, read Globalists by Quinn Slobodian, which I'll be hopefully talking to you from pretty soon. These frameworks were created after the Second World War, primarily by the the neoliberals within the International Chamber of Commerce, who shaped the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs (GATT), which they hoped would be a tool that would allow their conception of markets to dominate the world. There's this sort of story that neoliberals existed on the fringes of academic and economic discourse in 1945 and really didn't get anywhere till the crises of the 1970s, and it's not exactly true. They certainly had a huge amount of sway when it came to building the architecture of global capital, which is the project that began in 1945 and it was fundamentally altered when Nixon took America off the gold standard in 1971. The neoliberals, the likes of Friedrich von Hayek, that were determined that the system they created would provide a kind of what they thought of as a corrective to countries that bowed to trade unions or minority groups wanting to have higher taxation and social welfare spending and redistribution of wealth in order to balance out historic injustices. In Hayek, and this spending would distort the finely tuned signals of the market. It would reward indolence and lead to increased levels of redistribution of wealth, and would have the effect of increasing inflation, which obviously neoliberals viewed as being the worst of all worlds. And so they had a profound influence right from the beginning of the post-war era. An appreciation of how centrally US capitalism figures, write the authors, in the general development of capitalism in the 100 years before World War II is key to understanding what impelled the American state to assume its new imperial role. But we also need to understand what made it capable of conjugating, to borrow Anderson's term, its particular power with the general task of coordination in the making of global capitalism. Anderson's view is that the US constitutional structures lack the carrying power of its economic and cultural ones, being more than the 18th century arrangements. While Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, in sharp contrast, see the US Constitution as having conferred a new kind of network power, well adapted to the creation of and management of globalization. While this is an important insight, it underplays not only the considerable power of the US Constitution that it gave the federal state to police the regime against insurrection, to make war, to promote trade, and to expand the Union territorially, but also the room it provided for the federal state to superintend the development of an informal empire. Abundant land and resources, access to large foreign pools of British capital and European labour, privileged capitalist development in the US. But it is the way in which these came to be combined through distinctive class relations, first in the independent commodity-producing farm economy, and then in the modern corporate economy, that lies at the roots of the uniquely dynamic nature of American capitalist development. Pivotal to this was the American state. Though often characterized as peculiarly weak or laissez-faire, its activism sustained the conditions for the success of US capitalism, and imprinted those successes with its own distinctive characteristics. Although he could not have imagined what this would actually look like 2 centuries later, it thereby fulfilled Thomas Jefferson's boast that no constitution was ever before as well calculated for the extensive empire and self-government. So the thesis in this book is that the creation of American capital and the ability of American capital to sustain empire, and also the role of the US state itself in facilitating empire, mainly a US empire, but facilitating the empire of capital itself, was hardwired into the Constitution, this document, which is the product of the Enlightenment and the 17th and 18th centuries. So the world in which we live, which is still to a greater extent dominated by US power, dominated by US capital and the interests of US capital, is born of specific events in the late 18th century. But how do we explain the dynamism which the American economy evidently exhibits? The authors write, a key characteristic of American economic development was the use of leading-edge technologies to deepen domestic capital accumulation through intensive growth, while an unprecedented extensive growth was facilitated by the state's expansion of territory within sovereign control, from Ohio to Texas to California to Oregon. So the ability to hoover up large amounts of territory from and dispossess Native Americans and get access to all these, in inverted commas, free resources is part of the answer. The other is the ability or the inclination to endless innovation. Basically, American capitalists in the 19th century and the 20th century understood better than probably anybody that the way that they would become ever richer was to endlessly innovate. And I think probably the decline of British imperial capital was the Britain's ability to lose sight of this one fundamental truth. Everything from about 1870 onwards has been a story of declinism, and it still is. And the decision to shift the focus of investment in Britain from industrial to financial capital to make short-term gains in the City of London as opposed to investing for the long term in Sheffield, Birmingham and Manchester goes a long way to explain the state of the country right now. The small-scale farming which engaged most white citizens as independent commodity producers, this is referring to America again, in competitive commercial agriculture spawned a process of agro-industrialization, first in the North Atlantic states and then, and especially in the new Midwestern states. Once the farmers were let loose on a fertile plain, this system of agriculture quickly generated huge surpluses for disposal elsewhere, revolutionized production methods across the wide range of agro-processing industries, and built an immense urban system to support and sustain the bare bones of production. Moreover, as early as the 1850s, workers in the new cities and towns became significant mass consumers of standardized goods, adding another key element in the distinctive socio-economic matrix of American development, a relatively high wage proletariat. The fact that by mid-century wages in the US were more than double those in Britain contributed strongly to pulling in vast pools of labour that were simultaneously being pushed out by unemployment in Europe. So there's a reason why America is such a source of riches for white European settlers in the 19th century. How is it possible that wages and therefore living standards for the most part are twice that of Europe? Well, it's because huge amounts of land have been acquired through dispossessing their native inhabitants. And the dynamism that the American economy possessed was kick-started by this one fundamental and inescapable and brutal fact. Much as the wealth of Great Britain and Britain's Industrial Revolution came from the exploitation and suffering of slaves in the West Indies, the surplus labour value accumulated from their toil went into the wealth of England and funded the Industrial Revolution. The author's right. In fact, an industrial working class had begun to emerge in the US by the time Alexis de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America, and he already discerned tensions emerging between it and the new oligarchy of factory owners. The shortage and mobility of skilled labour was a key factor here, reinforced by the bargaining power that an abundance of land and the possibility of starting a family farm gave workers in the labour market, at least initially. By placing limits on the degree of exploitation employers could impose, in spite of the high rate of immigration of new workers, this spurred more capital-intensive production. It also provided levels of income that allowed some craftsmen to start their own factories and forced factory owners to promote the development of labour-saving innovations in machine technology and factory organisation. Two other factors reinforced this trend. One was the system of protective tariffs, which in spite of northern merchant and southern planter opposition was in place from the 1820s. Another was the initiation of and coordination by the federal government, acting through the War Department's Federal Armory, of new production methods using interchangeable parts, precision gauges, specialist machines operated by relatively unskilled labour, and management control information systems, the American system of manufacturing, so much admired in Europe by the middle of the 19th century, which again presents us with all sorts of interesting thoughts about the role of the state in the development of mass production and the factory system and enterprise in general. In recent years, the economist Mariana Mazzucato has made the point that if you take the example of the iPhone is a product of is created almost exclusively by state research, by government-backed research, mainly in the US, but some in other parts of the world. Every component was created by state funding and subsidies, and the military-industrial complex, which is essentially a huge sort of state-funded enterprise, created everything that goes into the smartphone, and without the state being able to take the sorts of risks that capitalists can't or won't, you wouldn't have the internet or a whole bunch of other things, and this appears to be as true all the way back in the mid 19th century as it is now, and a lot of in America, a lot of the kind of the processes needed for the development of American mass production towards the end of the 19th century and into the 20th is the product of the innovations pioneered by the US Department of War, obviously to quickly make large numbers of things like rifles or cannonballs or artillery shells or what have you. Anyway, so the purpose of this podcast is to kind of lay out some ideas that we're going to pursue throughout the year about particularly with the nature of capitalism, about what its kind of what's its sort of kind of originating ideas are. I mean, there is a whole bunch of other stuff to say on the subject, and the next book I want to introduce, and perhaps I will do next week, will be The Anxious Triumph by Donald Sassoon. But here, looking at it from Panitch and Gindin's perspective, seeing capitalism in the 20th century as the product of American empire, and inseparable from American empire, it's important to kind of explore the origins of both 19th century American capital and 19th century American empire, which we shall move on to. Anyway, I hope you found this useful today. There's lots of new content for students at the Explaining History website, explaininghistory.org. I am currently putting out various information pages for students of the Russian Revolution, so go check it out, and if you can share it, that's great. It's all free of charge, and it'll be kind of handy when the exams come around. So check it out, explaininghistory.org, and you can also find us at the Explaining History podcast Facebook group on Facebook, of all places. Thanks very much, and I'll catch you next time. All the best. Bye-bye.